I will begin with what I told the board, because it is the clearest summary I have managed in 9 months of trying to summarize it. On day 1 of transit cycle Kelavar 9, I administered a standard Tier 2 chemical suppression protocol to containment subject designate Kira Vasquez, human female, 31 years of age, 61.3 kilograms, captured during the Orith system interdiction action and flagged for biological assessment at Vethori Station 11. By day 3, I had raised the dosage to Tier 4. By day 6, I was at the threshold of Tier 6. A dosage we have never administered to any species outside of controlled laboratory conditions. Dosage that, in our own subjects, produces complete metabolic suppression within 40 minutes and carries a documented mortality rate of 11% above Tier 5. By day 14, the last day of the transit cycle, I was logging readings on my station board that showed perfect suppression stability, and I was preparing, internally, commendation for myself for running the cleanest clean containment protocol in the division's operational history. The human was awake for all 14 days. She was not performing wakefulness. She was not suppressing symptoms or fighting through chemical fog through some act of will. She was not exceptional in any way that she was consciously controlling. Her body was processing the compounds, hepatic analogs, the structures we later learned humans call a liver and its secondary enzymatic cascade, were identifying each molecule we introduced, breaking it down at the molecular level, and discharging the metabolic byproducts through her respiratory system in quantities so small our environmental scrubbers recycled them without flagging anything unusual. The suppression readings I was logging as evidence of protocol success were simply what a human's resting physiology looks like. Calm. Low output. Quiet. We had no baseline for comparison, so we read rest as sedation. We read a functioning metabolism doing its job as a metabolism shutting down. I want to be precise about this, because the review board's first instinct was to frame my error as negligence or incompetence, and I am not going to accept that characterization without providing the full technical picture. Vethori chemical suppression doctrine was developed across 430 years of containment work spanning 61 species. In every species we have ever chemically suppressed, the suppression agent works by targeting the primary neuroinhibitory receptors, structures that, across all 61 species, perform essentially the same function. The suppression compound binds those receptors, saturates them, and prevents the electrochemical signal cascade that would otherwise produce arousal, directed movement, and higher cognitive function. The subject's neural activity drops. Their metabolic rate drops in concert because a suppressed nervous system draws less fuel. The readout is unambiguous. You watch the activity curves descend, and when they level off in the suppressed range, your protocol is working. Vasquez's curves leveled off immediately. That was the problem. That was the entire problem, and I will explain it in terms even a non-pharmacologist on this board can follow. She walked into containment. We administered the first Tier 2 dose. Within 40 minutes, every metric on my board settled into the suppressed range and stayed there. I logged it as protocol success. I did not question it because I had no reason to question it. The numbers said suppression. Everything I had been trained to read said suppression. What the numbers were actually saying was, this organism, at rest, no chemical interference whatsoever, produces physiological readings that fall inside our suppressed range for every species we have ever processed. The Tier 2 dose did not change her readings because the Tier 2 dose did not change anything. Body had it processed in under 2 hours. I know this now. I know this because on day 15, when Kelavar 9 docked at Station 11 and the containment team opened the cell to retrieve what they expected to be a deeply sedated transfer, subject Vasquez was sitting on the floor with her back against the cell wall, eating from a nutrient pack she had apparently sourced from somewhere. We later determined she had persuaded supply technician Orvithgan to pass through the ventilation grill on day 7, having established what Orvithgan described, in his own after-action statement, as a friendly working relationship, and she looked up at the containment team with an expression that 3 separate officers independently described in their reports as patient. That is what I presented to the board in the preliminary session. That is the technical foundation. Follows is the archive review, because the board requested it, and because I believe the archive review is the only way to convey the full scope of what the 14-day transit actually contained. I will proceed chronologically. Day 1, Hour 3. Suppression board shows Tier 2 protocol, active, subject nominal, suppression stable. What the cell recorder shows. Kez sitting cross-legged in the center of the cell floor, eyes open, running her fingers in a slow methodical pattern across the cell's internal wall surface. Not agitated, not exploring frantically. A slow, systematic tactile survey, conducted with the focused attention of someone cataloging material properties. She does this for 40 minutes. Then she lays down and sleeps. Actually sleeps genuine restless cycle sleep, which looks on my board identical to what I was already reading, so I log nothing unusual. I want the board to note. She slept for 6 hours, woke up, ate the first of the 3 nutrient packs she had been issued for the transit, and spent the next 4 hours doing what I can only describe as memorizing the cell. She lay flat on her back and looked at the ceiling for extended intervals. She tapped the wall at measured intervals. Not random, not anxious, metronomic, like someone timing echoes. She sat in each corner of the cell in sequence, spending roughly 40 minutes in each, and while sitting, she looked at the door from 4 different angles. The cell recorder does not capture audio at that resolution, so I cannot tell you what she was calculating, but I can tell you she was not distressed, and I can tell you the behavior pattern is not consistent with any known anxiety or disorientation profile. It is consistent, our behavioral science consultants later told us, with what humans apparently call a security survey. Standard practice, apparently, for the specific category of human professional she belonged to. She was a logistics coordinator. That was the classification on her capture dossier. Logistics coordinator, attached to a human resupply depot. I note for the board that this classification was assigned by the field interdiction team and was based on the competence of her work terminal and her physical proximity at time of capture to a supply manifest. I will return to the matter of her actual professional background at the appropriate point in the review, Day 2, Hour 14. I have raised the protocol to Tier 3 and logged it as a precautionary escalation based on the subject's continued stable readings. A standard practice, when a subject's suppression curve does not show the characteristic gradual descent we expect as compounds accumulate. In my log, I note that human physiology may produce atypical accumulation curves. This is an accurate observation, simply not in the direction I assumed. The cell recorder shows Vasquez approximately 2 hours into what appears to be an exercise routine. I want to be specific. She is not pacing, which would be a stress indicator. She is performing structured, progressive physical activity, a series of movements that cycle through what appear to be strength exercises, balance exercises, and cardiovascular sequences. And she is doing this in the available floor space of a cell designed for species with a significantly smaller physical profile than hers. The cell is 2.1 meters by 1.8 meters. She adapts every movement to the available geometry without apparent frustration. She has been, by this point, in chemical suppression for 38 hours, at a dosage calibrated to suppress a being of her mass and neural complexity by a factor of approximately 12. She is performing what I can only call a training session. When she finishes, it takes approximately 70 minutes. She lies down and sleeps again. I want the board to be very clear about what this meant pharmacologically. Tier 3 suppression in any species we have processed shows marked reduction in voluntary motor activity. The subject does not have the neurochemical fuel to sustain complex coordinated movement. The reason is straightforward. Suppression compounds block the receptor cascade, the neural signal traffic drops, and metabolic resource allocation shifts away from voluntary motor systems. A Tier 3 subject in any species we have processed does not exercise. A Tier 3 subject sits or lies down and may exhibit low-level involuntary movement and slow respiratory cycling. Vasquez was using her cell floor for inverted body weight load exercises. At the time, I attributed it to human physiological variability and logged a note for the Station 11 research team. I did not consider escalating to Tier 4 for another 11 hours, because my board continued to show suppression stable. Day 3, Hour 9. Tier 4 is active. The subject's readings remain nominal. The cell recorder shows Vasquez standing at the cell door, looking through the hops panel at the corridor outside, speaking. Audio capture at corridor level picks this up. She is greeting guard technician Sethovpalt by name. She has learned his name, having heard it used once, 2 days prior, when I addressed him in the corridor outside the cell at the start of his shift. She says in our language, the pronunciation that is rough but intelligible. Sethovpalt. Good shift. 2 words of recognizable Vithori working language greeting. She had apparently been listening to every exchange that occurred within auditory range of her cell since the beginning of the transit, cataloging vocabulary, cross-referencing the same words heard in different contexts until their meanings became clear. Sethovpalt's response, captured on the corridor audio, is a pause of approximately 4 seconds followed by, "You should be asleep," to which Vasquez replies, in a mixture of what I now understand to be standard human language and the 2 Vithori words she has acquired. "I know, sorry." And then, to repeat, "What is your food?" What follows is a 23-minute conversation that I will not reproduce in full for the board, but the substance of which is, Sethovpalt, who is apparently a being of reasonable temperament and somewhat limited professional caution, explains, in simplified working language, what his nutritional provision packet contains, and Vasquez explains, in a mixture of mime and her accumulating Vithori vocabulary, that her standard nutrient packs have been producing what she describes with considerable physical expressiveness as digestive disagreement. Sethovpalt finds this funny. Vasquez finds Sethovpalt finding it funny satisfying, apparently, because her affect for the remainder of the conversation is warmer and more animated. At the end of the conversation, Sethovpalt does not bring her different food. But he does stay at the observation panel for another 10 minutes after the exchange formally ends, and Vasquez spends that time teaching him, apparently by patient repetition, the human word for good is a 2-syllable vocalization that Sethovpalt reproduces badly but earnestly. I'm not going to editorialize about what this interaction means. I am simply going to note that it is day 3, the subject is under Tier 4 chemical suppression, and she has just made a friend. Day 4, Hour 6. The ship's environmental monitoring system flags a minor anomaly in the containment level air recycling unit. An elevated output of certain metabolic byproducts in the cell-adjacent processing loop. The system's diagnostic subroutine categorizes this as consistent with standard organism, in containment respiration variants, and clears the flag automatically. The flag is recorded and forwarded to the maintenance log. I reviewed this maintenance flag for the first time 11 months after the transit ended, when the Station SC research team's pharmacological analysis was complete, and I understood what I was looking at. The elevated byproducts were the processed remnants of the Tier 4 suppression compound. Her body had identified the compound, broken it down, and expelled the metabolic debris through her lungs. The environmental system read it as ordinary biological exhaust, which, chemical standpoint, is exactly what it was. She had metabolized a Tier 4 suppressant dose completely, at the cellular level, and the evidence of this was logged by an automated maintenance flag that cleared itself and sat in a maintenance archive for 11 months waiting someone to understand what it meant. The flag was in the system the entire time. 9 months later, a junior research assistant found it in 40 minutes of archive searching. I have been in this discipline for 22 years, and I would not have known what to look for. She had metabolized the compound so cleanly that the only evidence was a routine environmental variance in air recycling output, the kind of variance the system generates dozens of times per transit cycle and dismisses without human review. She was gone from the compound before the maintenance log had finished writing the entry. The system noted the anomaly and moved on. So did I. I will move forward, because I do not find it productive to dwell on this particular detail for longer than is necessary to establish the pattern. Day 4, Hour 22. The cell recorder shows Vasquez working at the cell's internal surface again, but differently than day 1. She is not doing the initial tactile survey. She is doing something more deliberate. She is tracing specific sections of the wall with her fingertip, repeating the same paths, and occasionally tapping with a specific rhythmic pattern and then stopping to listen. The behavioral science team's assessment is that she is conducting resonance mapping, a technique that involves introducing a vibratory signal into a surface and interpreting the reflection to infer the structure behind it. Humans apparently do this by ear, calibrating against the sound of their own produced vibration, and experienced practitioners can develop a fairly detailed model of wall composition and thickness using nothing more than a finger and the side of their head. She is determining what is behind the cell walls. She is not frantic about it. She is not agitated. She works through each wall section with the same patient methodical focus she brought to day one's initial survey, and when she has covered the cell's interior surfaces completely. It takes approximately 3 hours, conducted across the day in intervals. She sits in the center of the cell floor with her eyes closed for 40 minutes. Then she eats her day 4 nutrient pack and goes to sleep. Day 5, hour 11. I escalate to tier 5 at hour 31 of day 5, following a further review of accumulation curves that continue to show no expected descent. I note in my log that I am beginning to suspect a calibration error in the dosage dispensary and submit a maintenance request. The maintenance team checks the dispensary and confirms it is functioning correctly. I log this as inconclusive and request a pharmacological consult from Station 11 for when we arrive. The cell recorder for day 5 shows the following at hour 11. Vasquez spending approximately 90 minutes lying on her back on the cell floor, eyes open, apparently doing nothing. I have reviewed this footage many times since the transit ended. She is not sleeping. Her eyes are tracking the ceiling in a slow, systematic pattern. Our behavioral science team's assessment is that she is mentally rehearsing spatial information, running what humans call a memory consolidation cycle, organizing and storing the environmental data she has been gathering. She is filing her notes. Hour 19, a second guard technician, Orvith Gann, the one who would later become the nutrient pack source, stops at the observation panel during his secondary corridor check. Vasquez is already at the panel when he arrives, having apparently heard his footstep pattern and distinguished it from Setov pulse well before he came into visual range. She addresses him by a descriptor she has constructed for him in Vethor working language, not his name, she does not yet know, but a 2-syllable phrase that roughly translates as the cautious one. And this is apparently accurate enough that Orvith Gann's recorded response is a visible startle. She spends the next 15 minutes of his patrol stop teaching him the same human vocabulary she taught Setov Palt with patient good humor. By hour 20 she knows his name. Hour 26. Vasquez is standing in the northwest corner of the cell, the corner with the most acute angle to the cell door's hinge side, and she is very still. She stands there for 11 minutes. The behavioral science team's reading of this footage is that she was calculating sight lines from the corridor camera to the cell interior, determining which portions of the cell floor were not captured by the camera's sweep, and confirming that the northwest corner was the largest of those blind spots. She then went and sat in the blind spot and ate her second nutrient pack. She did not need the blind spot for anything at that time. She was not concealing anything from us that we had any means to act on. The behavioral science team's assessment is that she was simply establishing, as a matter of professional habit, where the unobserved space was, for later reference, in case it became relevant. I have reviewed that 11 minutes of footage perhaps 40 times. She does not look calculating. She does not look like someone running a threat assessments. She looks like someone who has briefly stopped to consider something, made a quiet decision and gone to sit down and eat. The decision was, I know where the blind spot is. The affect was, and now I will file that away. Day 6, hour 4. This is the entry that required the most extensive subsequent analysis, and I will describe it in detail. My suppression board shows tier 5 active, suppression stable. On the board it looks identical to every previous day. In the cell, Vasquez is awake at what is, based on the ship's internal time markers, approximately 0400 in the Kelavar 9 operational cycle, the lowest traffic period of the entire ship's daily rotation, the interval with the minimum number of crew members active anywhere on the vessel. She is awake because she has not lost sleep. She has been sleeping exactly as much as she chooses to sleep, which is 6 to 7 hours per cycle, regular as a clock at the time she selects. She wakes at 0400, she is alert within seconds, and she spends 20 minutes doing nothing visible. Simply sitting, still, in the center of the cell, with her eyes open and her breathing measured. The behavioral science team, reviewing this footage, assessed that she was listening to the ship. That is not a metaphorical assessment. They mean it literally. At 0400, the Kelevar 9's drive systems are running at minimum transit load. The structural vibration profile of the ship is at its cleanest and most interpretable. And Vasquez, who has been cataloging vibration and sound data for 5 full days, is sitting in the cell and reading the ship the way a navigator reads a chart. She remains still for 20 minutes. Then she moves to the eastern wall and places her palm flat against it, and holds this position for approximately 3 minutes. And then she moves to the floor and places her palm against the floor and holds this for approximately 2 minutes. Then she goes back to the center of the cell and sits down. I cannot tell you with certainty what she concluded. The behavioral science team's assessment, D, combined with the route and access professional background we later identified, suggests she was triangulating the ship's drive and recycling system vibration signatures to map the vessel's internal layout from inside a sealed cell, using nothing but her hand and the building's transmitted sound. This is, the team noted, a documented technique in human special operations infrastructure work. It requires training, practice, and a kind of sustained attentional focus that, in their words, most species cannot maintain for more than a few minutes before the signal becomes noise. She did it for 20 minutes, at a 405 days into a transit, under what my board showed as Tier 5 chemical suppression. Then she went back to sleep for 3 hours, woke up, did her exercise routine, and had a conversation with Setov Palt about what the weather was like on his home planet. Day 7, Tier 6. I want to provide the board with the full pharmacological context for Tier 6 dosage, because I believe the board may not be familiar with what Tier 6 actually represents in operational terms. Tier 6 is not a standard operational suppression level. Tier 6 exists in our protocols, the way a structural load tolerance exists in engineering, specifications, as a documented outer limit included in the documentation to establish where the boundary is, with the understanding that operations should never approach it. Tier 6 dosage, in the species it has been tested on, in controlled laboratory conditions, produces the following: complete inhibition of voluntary motor activity within 20 minutes, progressive suppression of autonomic regulatory functions, including respiratory rhythm modulation, within 60 minutes, and full metabolic collapse in subjects above a certain mass threshold within 4 to 6 hours. The 11% mortality rate I mentioned earlier was calculated at Tier 5. Tier 6 has not been administered to living subjects outside of 2 specific research contexts, and in both of those contexts, the research was stopped. I administered Tier 6 to a living subject because my suppression board showed me a subject who was not suppressing, and I had no other tool in my pharmacological inventory, and I was, at that point, frightened. I want to be honest with the board about this. I was not frightened that the subject was dangerous. I was frightened that my board was lying to me, and I did not yet know in what direction it was lying, and I wanted the readings to change in some way that told me what was happening. I thought, Tier 6 will change something. I thought, the curve will move. I thought, something on my board will finally tell me something different from what it has been telling me for 6 days. What my board told me at hour 3 of Tier 6 dosage was suppression. Stable. What the cell recorder showed me at that same hour was Vasquez conducting what I can now identify, having reviewed the relevant human professional training documentation obtained by our intelligence division after the transit, as a structured contact interrogation debrief protocol. She was sitting cross-legged on the cell floor, eyes closed, reciting, in a low murmur that the cell recorder's audio barely captures, what she had observed. She was talking herself through the ship. She knew, at that point, the following: that Kelevar 9 was a Vithori transit vessel of the Pelith-class intermediate carrier configuration, identifiable by the particular sound signature of its drive system, which she had been cataloging since day one. That the ship carried a complement of between 18 and 23 crew members. Inferred from the pattern of footstep traffic she had been tracking in the corridor. That the shift rotation for the containment level corridor guard was 4 hours on, 8 hours off, with a secondary corridor check pass at hour 2 of each off-rotation cycle. She had timed this to within 7 minutes across 6 days. That the emergency docking bay was aft, 2 levels up from the containment block, accessible via a maintenance corridor that ran adjacent to the recycling station, whose output she had identified from the particular vibration frequency it introduced into the cell wall every 4 hours. She had not been to the maintenance corridor. She had not been to the recycling station. She had not been outside her cell. She had assembled this picture from audio, from vibration, from corridor traffic patterns, 2 guard technicians who found her personable, and from 20 minutes of palm-on-wall listening at Aerofo 400 on day 6. She recited all of it in a calm, even cadence, eyes closed, in the unhurried manner of someone reviewing a file before a meeting. I listened to that audio recording for the first time 11 days after the transit ended, sitting alone in my office at Station 11, and I will tell the board that I sat with it for a long time before I filed it. Day 8, hour 14. Vasquez asks Setoff-Palt, during his shift panel stop, what the destination is. She phrases this, with her accumulated vocabulary and considerable gestural supplementation. Setoff-Palt, who has by this point developed what the behavioral science team characterizes as a genuinely warm collegial regard for her, tells her, Station 11. He says it in a way that implies she should recognize the name. She repeats it back to him carefully, and he confirms. Then she asks him, with equal care, what Station 11 does. There is a pause in the audio recording here. Setoff-Palt is, apparently, considering whether answering this question falls within his professional remit. The behavioral science team notes that this pause lasts approximately 6 seconds, and then Setoff-Palt, because he is a being of decent instincts operating slightly outside the envelope of his training, answers her anyway. He tells her it is a research station. He tells her it is primarily a biological research station. He uses a Vettori term for assessment that Vasquez has not encountered before, and when she asks him to repeat it, he does. And she incorporates it into her vocabulary in real time, using it correctly in the next sentence she speaks. She says, assessment of me, he says. Of many things, she considers this. Her expression on the cell recorder is attentive and not alarmed. The expression of someone receiving information they half expected and are now organizing. She nods. This is a human gestural signal that Setoff-Palt has learned over 8 days, means she is acknowledging what she has heard. Shh. Then she asks him what the food is like at Station 11, and whether it is better than what she's been getting on the ship. And Setoff-Palt says he thinks it probably is, and she says good, and the exchange ends on a note of comfortable informality that Setoff-Palt will later describe in his after-action statement as normal. He writes, it felt like a normal conversation. I am aware, in retrospect, it was not. Hour 22. Orvith Gann, during his secondary corridor check pass, spends his usual 12 minutes at the observation panel. Vasquez teaches him 3 additional vocabulary items she has been developing since day 7. Terms related to navigation and directional reference, acquired through careful listening during crew exchanges in the corridor above. She frames the lesson as casual mutual language practice, asking Orvith Gann to teach her the Vettori navigational terms in exchange for their human equivalents. Orvith Gann teaches her 7 navigational terms over the course of the exchange. He will not, in his after-action statement, characterize this as providing operationally relevant information. He will note that he believed, genuinely, that she was interested in language for its own sake, because she had shown consistent enthusiasms for learning Vettori vocabulary across the transit, and this enthusiasm seemed to him sincere. The behavioral science team assesses that it was sincere. The enthusiasm was real. She also happened to now know the Vettori terms for aft, emergency access, maintenance passage, and transit lock release. She thanks him for the lesson. He passes another nutrient pack through the ventilation grill. She says the phrase she has learned for, this is better than the other one, and Orvith Gann, on the audio recording, can be heard laughing. Day 10, hour 9. There is a brief entry from this day that I include because the behavioral science team flagged it as significant, although it did not register as significant to me at the time I reviewed the initial archive. Vasquez, at approximately 0900 in the ship's operational cycle, is standing at the cell door's observation panel. She is not waiting for a guard. No one is in the corridor. She is looking at the panel mechanism itself, the locking assembly on the exterior face of the door, visible through the transparent observation window, and she is studying it with the same focused, unhurried attention she has brought to everything else. She looks at it for approximately 4 minutes. Then she steps back from the door and sits down in the center of the cell floor with her eyes closed and remains there for 25 minutes. She is not doing anything observable. She appears to the camera to be resting. The behavioral science team's assessment is that she is working through the mechanism in her mind, tracing the assembly logic, identifying the operating sequence, considering how the mechanism functions from the exterior, and whether its function is accessible from the interior under any condition. She is not planning to open the door. She is understanding the door. She is, as is, apparently, her professional training and disposition, ensuring that she knows everything there is to know about every barrier between her and the outside of the space she is in. 4 minutes of looking, 25 minutes of thinking. Then she opens her eyes, gets up, does her exercise routine. Day 11, hour 22. This is the entry the board asked about specifically. I will read it in full. Vasquez is at the observation panel. Orvith Gann is on his secondary corridor check pass. He has, at this point, been passing the nutrient packs to her through the ventilation grill for 4 days. A fact he disclosed in his after-action statement with what I can only describe as the sheepish candor of someone who has accepted that things went wrong, but genuinely does not understand the mechanism by which his small kindnesses contributed to a situation he could not have predicted. He is a being of average professional competence who encountered a subject with an unusually effective interpersonal capability and behaved in the way that most beings of average professional competence would behave in that situation. He became fond of her. The exchange, captured on the corridor audio, proceeds as follows. Orvith Gann, during his stop at the panel, asks Vasquez, in the mixed working language shorthand they have developed over 11 days, why she has not tried to leave. He phrases it carefully, as if he is not sure whether asking the question puts him in professional jeopardy, but he asks it anyway, because he is clearly curious. Vasquez is quiet for a moment. Then she says, in the clearest and most carefully constructed Vethori working language sentence she has produced, across the 14-day recording archive, the better option is not yet here. Orvith Gann, after a pause, says, what option? Vasquez says, I do not know yet, but I will know it when I see it. Orvith Gann does not know what to do with this. His recorded response is a sound the behavioral science team characterizes as a vocalization of combined amusement and discomfort. He says, eventually, you are strange. Vasquez says, yes. There is a pause of perhaps 8 seconds, which on the audio recording feels considerably longer, and then Vasquez says, Orvith Gann, you are a good one. I want you to know that. The behavioral science team notes that this is a closing of accounts statement, a social gesture that humans apparently use to indicate warm regard toward an individual they expect to be separated from. They assess that Vasquez at day 11 had already calculated the most likely transit conclusion and was beginning to organize her interpersonal situation accordingly. Orvith Gann says, after another long pause, you are also good. His pronunciation of the human word for good, the one she taught him on day 3, is, on the recording, recognizable. They do not speak again that shift. Day 11, hour 37. Hit. Challenge. I include the entry because the board should understand the full state of my professional situation at this point in the transit, and because it is relevant to the question of why I did not escalate to a non-chemical containment approach earlier. At hour 37 of day 11, I filed my 3rd pharmacological consult request to Station 11, marked urgent. The first 2 had been filed on day 5 and day 8, respectively. The day 5 request received a boilerplate acknowledgement. The day 8 request was queued for review by a transit specialist and closed administratively. The duty note reads, subject readings nominal per Forwarded log, no action required, because my forwarded log showed, on its face, exactly what it always showed: suppression, stable. My day 11 urgent request included the following note, which I am reading verbatim from my own filing, because I want it on record. Subject physiological readings have remained stable at suppressed range parameters through 6 consecutive dosage escalations from Tier 2 to Tier 6. No accumulation curve descent observed at any tier. Dosage dispensary confirmed functional. Recommend immediate consultation. Concerned this represents either a species-specific metabolic anomaly or a systematic measurement error I am unable to identify from within the transit. The response received 14 hours later was, acknowledged. Flag for comprehensive review upon arrival. Maintain current protocol. Readings are nominal. I maintained current protocol. The readings were nominal. Because the readings were always nominal. Because the readings were not measuring suppression. They were measuring a human being sitting quietly in a cell, which produces, in humans, a physiological signature our instruments read as suppressed. Because the instruments were designed against a different biological standard, and nobody ever put a human through a suppression protocol before. That is the institutional context. I want the board to have it. I also want the board to have the following. At the time I filed that Day 11 urgent request, I had been privately experiencing what I can only describe as a growing professional dread that I did not have the vocabulary to formally articulate. My board said everything was fine. My instrument said everything was fine. The pharmacological doctrine said that if my instruments showed suppression stable, suppression was stable. Something in my professional assessment. Something accumulated from 11 days of escalating dosage and unchanged readings and maintenance, confirmations and ignored consultation requests, was telling me that I was not in control of the situation I was supposed to be managing. I was right. I was not in control of the situation. I had never been in control of the situation. The situation had been someone else's, the first hour of the first day. And that person had been politely waiting for me to stop doing things to her and get out of the way. I did not know that. But I knew something was wrong. I want the board to understand that this is not a defense of my professional conduct. It is a description of what it feels like to operate inside a doctrine that has no category for the thing that is happening to you. You do not fail to act because you are incompetent. You fail to act because every instrument you have tells you that you are acting correctly, and the only evidence that you are not is a formless unease that your training gives you no framework for filing. Day 12. 4 through 12. I include this block because it is the most sustained, continuous recording of what Vasquez does when she believes she is entirely unobserved, and I want the board to understand that belief was accurate. The corridor was empty. I was asleep. The automated monitoring system was running. No person, anywhere on Calavar 9, was actively watching the cell feed. She worked 8 continuous hours, with 2 breaks for water and 1 for food, and a 40-minute interval I assess as a deliberate consolidation rest. She conducted a comprehensive review of everything she had assembled across previous 11 days. She did this verbally, alone, in a measured recitation that moved through each major knowledge domain in sequence. The ship's physical layout as she had inferred it. The crew complement and rotation schedule, the 2 guard technicians, and her assessment of each of their behavioral profiles, the destination and its probable function, the navigational vocabulary, the cell door mechanism, the emergency docking bay and the route to it, the maintenance corridor and its vibration signature, the recycling station and its cycle interval, corridor camera positions and their sweep angles, and finally, explicitly, her assessment of her own physical condition. On that last point, she is specific. She notes that she has experienced no detectable cognitive impairment, no motor function degradation, no sensory disturbance, and no sleep disruption attributable to any external cause across 11 days. She notes that her physical conditioning has been maintained through daily exercise. She notes that she is, in her phrase, operating at standard. She then states, quietly, that she has enough to act. She then states equally quietly that she is not going to act yet. She gives her reasons for assessing decision in the same methodical sequence she has applied to everything else. Incomplete information on Station 11's physical layout. Uncertain confirmation of the emergency docking bay access route. The presence of Setoft Palt and Orvith Gann in the most probable action path, and her assessment that both of them have behaved well toward her, and she has no quarrel with them, and the probability, which she assesses as high, that a research context will provide her with more useful intelligence about the Vethori operational structure than an escape attempt that succeeds, the ship and fails at the next barrier. She weighs all of this out loud, alone in the cell, at a 600, in a ship she has mapped from inside a locked room, and then she stops and she is quiet for a moment and she says, one sentence, to no one, to the empty cell, there will be a better option. Then she goes to sleep. Day 13, hour 28. Compressed version of the Day 12 review, conducted in the northwest corner blind spot. She has updated her assessment, with 2 additional items, acquired in the last 48 hours. Confirmation from a corridor exchange between 2 crew members she has learned to identify by voice, that the docking approach to Station 11 involves a standard deceleration sequence with a gravitational irregularity window in the aft sections, and a refinement of her estimate of the maintenance corridor layout, derived from a new vibration signature she isolated at 0400. She updates her action or weight calculation in the light of these refinements. The conclusion is the same. She is going to wait. Day 14, hour 31. Kelevar 9 docks at Station 11. The containment retrieval team, 4 officers, standard protocol, expecting a deeply sedated transfer subject at most capable of minimal voluntary movement. Cycles open the cell door. Vasquez is sitting on the floor with her back against the cell wall. She has finished the last of the nutrient packs. The empty packaging is folded into a precise small rectangle and placed neatly in the cell's waste receptacle. A detail that appears in 3 separate officers' reports and that none of them could fully articulate why they included, except that it seemed somehow significant. She looks up at the retrieval team. The lead officer's report describes her expression as follows: calm, patient, the expression of someone who has been waiting for the next part to begin. She stands up on her own. She does not resist. She comes with them without being asked to, stepping into the corridor with the easy, orienting awareness of someone who has been in the space before, and she has not been in the corridor, not once, not physically, but she knows it. She knows the corridor the way you know a room you have studied from a photograph for 2 weeks. When they pass the maintenance corridor junction, she looks at it, just looks, for approximately 1 second as they walk past. The lead officer did not include this detail in his initial report. He added it in the supplemental 3 days later, when the fuller picture had emerged. He writes, I do not know why I remember it. She did not stop. She did not reach for anything. She looked at the junction, the way you might look at a street you have heard about, but never walked down, as if confirming it was where she expected it to be. It was where she expected it to be. That is the archive. That is the 14 days. I will now address the question the board asked in the preliminary session. What is the mechanism? The mechanism is not exotic. It is not a special adaptation in the sense of a single dramatic mutation. It is, our research team's assessment tells me, the consequence of a particular combination of ordinary mammalian biology that, in the specific context of chemical suppression compounds designed around receptor structures shared by 61 other species, produces a systematic non-response. The human liver is large, disproportionately large relative to body mass when compared to most species in our taxonomy. It contains a redundant enzymatic processing system that serves multiple metabolic functions, one of which is the rapid identification and neutralization of foreign chemical compounds. This system evolved in the context of an environment, Earth's surface biosphere, that is, by the assessment of our xenobiology division, extraordinarily chemically hostile. Human ancestors were apparently exposed to a continuous low-level background of naturally occurring toxins, pathogens, and chemical compounds in their food, water, and environment over millions of years, and the survivors were those whose hepatic systems could process these compounds quickly and efficiently. The result is an organism that, at baseline, maintains a standing enzymatic library capable of identifying and neutralizing a very wide range of chemical structures at a rate that is, By our standards, implausible. Our suppression compounds were designed around species that evolved in significantly more chemically stable environments. The receptor structures are the same. The compounds bind. And then in the human case, the compounds are processed and excreted before the binding reaches the threshold required for sustained suppression effect. The dosage required to saturate the human hepatic processing capacity, according to our research team's extrapolation from the transit data, approximately 40 to 60 times our Tier 6 level. Our Tier 6 level is the dosage that collapses a non-human subject in 4 to 6 hours. 40 to 60 times Tier 6 is not a dosage. It is a notation in a research paper. It is a number that exists to describe the scale of the gap. It is not something we can administer and expect the subject to remain intact for assessment. What this means, operationally, is the following. There is no veterinary chemical suppression compound that will suppress a human. Not at any dosage we can safely administer. Possibly not at any dosage at all, given what the research team describes as the human liver's apparent capacity to upregulate its enzymatic processing in response to sustained chemical load, a capability they have not confirmed, but assess as probable given the transit data, in which the effective metabolic clearance time for each successive dosage tier was actually shorter, not longer, than the previous one. She was clearing the compounds faster at Tier 6 than she was at Tier 2. I want the board to hold for a moment. I want the board to understand what this means for escalation doctrine. Our protocol assumes that more is more, that increasing the dose will eventually suppress. This is true for every species we have ever processed. It is not true for this species. More does not produce more suppression, produces a more efficient processing response. The organism identifies the increased chemical load as an elevated environmental threat and regulates its neutralization capacity to meet it. It does this automatically, below conscious awareness. As a background metabolic function, we were not increasing the suppression. We were training her liver. I will submit the full pharmacological analysis under separate cover. The research team has also flagged a secondary finding, that this same hepatic upregulation capacity may explain several anomalous results from other institutions' chemical interaction record involving human subjects. But that analysis falls outside my direct remit, and I will not address it here. For this session, I want to present one additional item from the archive before I conclude. After the Day 15 retrieval, after Vasquez was walked to the Station 11 assessment intake and formally logged, the intake officer conducted a standard suboptimal classification confirmation review. Part of this review involves verifying the field capture team's professional designation for the subject. The intake officer noted a discrepancy. The field capture team had logged Vasquez as a logistics coordinator based on the contents of her work terminal and her proximity to a supply manifest. The intake officer, reviewing the full data package forwarded from the interdiction team, noted that the work terminal also contained, behind one additional access layer that the field team had not opened, a secondary operational profile. This profile indicated that Vasquez held a concurrent designation, not a cover assignment, a secondary active professional role she had been performing in parallel with her resupply logistics work for approximately 3 years. She was a route and access surveyor for the Human Special Operations Infrastructure Directorate. Her specific professional function, her trained, credentialed, practiced professional function, was entering unfamiliar spaces, mapping them completely, identifying all access and egress points, assessing all personnel, evaluating all options, and producing a full operational picture of a location for teams that would come after her. She had 14 days in a cell under what we believed was maximum chemical suppression, done exactly what she was trained to do. The intake officer flagged this to the assessment team lead. The assessment team lead flagged it to the station director. The station director convened this review board. I will close with the question the board chair asked me at the end of our preliminary session, because I think it is the right question to close on, and because I want my answer recorded formally. The board chair asked, given everything that emerged from the archive review, given the full picture of what Vasquez was doing across those 14 days, what is the most significant finding? I said. It is not the pharmacology. The pharmacology is significant. The pharmacology rewrites our containment doctrine for this species entirely. We will need to develop entirely new approaches, and I have no confidence. Given what the research team has told me about the hepatic upregulation question, that we will find a chemical answer in the near term. Our doctrine assumes a chemical solution exists, and that the task is finding the right compound at the right dosage. For this species, that assumption may not hold. The research team's current position is that the dosage required to overwhelm the human hepatic system may be incompatible with keeping the subject in a condition suitable for assessment. We may be facing a binary: suppress them to the point of assessment viability failure, or not suppress them at all. That is significant. It is immediately operational. It will consume a great deal of the division's resources going forward. But it is not the most significant finding. The most significant finding is the 4-minute monologue in the northwest corner of the cell on day 13. She was not trapped. She was not helpless. She was not surviving. She was operating. And when she completed her assessment, when she had weighed the information available, calculated the option landscape, evaluated the risks, and considered the human cost of each available path, she decided to wait. She was not waiting because she had no choice. She was waiting because the better option was not yet there, and she was willing to hold her position, patient and quiet and entirely aware until it was. We did not contain her. She chose to stay. The implications of that distinction, every containment protocol this division operates, are ones I will leave to the board to work through. I have submitted my pharmacological analysis, my recommendations for doctrine revision, and my formal request to be reassigned to non-containment pharmacological research, which I believe represents a more suitable use of my remaining expertise. I have one final note for the record. The Station 11 research team's first formal session with Vasquez, conducted 3 days after her arrival, produced a secondary finding that has not been formally circulated, but that I believe the board should have. When the team's lead interviewer asked Vasquez, at the end of the session, whether she had anything to add, she said yes. She said she would like to note, for the record, that both Setov Palt and Orvith Gann had behaved with consistent courtesy and basic decency across the transit, and that she hoped this was reflected in their professional evaluations. The interviewer, apparently not certain how to respond to this, said he would pass it along. Vasquez said good, and then, "Also, I have some questions about the facility. When you have time." I am told the interviewer requested a 10-minute recess at that point. The session notes for that recess contain one line, written in the interviewer's personal shorthand, and not intended, evidently, for the official record. It was included in the file forwarded to me in error. It reads, "She has been mapping this place since she walked in the door. The division has since created a new subject classification category. It is called in the formal taxonomy, condition, aware, voluntary compliance. It has one entry in the registry. I will take questions." The board had several. The first question, from the deputy chair, was whether the new classification category, condition, aware, voluntary compliance, was intended to apply only to Vasquez or to humans as a species. I said, to humans as a species, pending further evidence. The research team's pharmacological analysis is unambiguous that the hepatic processing mechanism is not individual. It is standard human biology. We have every reason to assume that any human placed in a Vithori chemical suppression protocol will produce the same result. We further have reason, given what the behavioral science team's profile of Vasquez's professional background tells us about the type of humans we are likely to be detaining in an interdiction context, to assume that the secondary behavior, the environmental mapping, the personnel assessment, the patient operational weighting, may also be a trained professional standard, rather than an individual exceptional capability. We do not yet know how widespread the relevant training is in the human professional population. We are attempting to find out. The deputy chair asked. How? I said, carefully. The second question from the senior medical officer on the board concerned the upregulation finding. The observation that Vasquez's metabolic clearance rate improved across the transit rather than declining. He asked whether this was a learned response, in the sense of the organism consciously adapting, or an automatic biological process. I said. Automatic, below conscious awareness. The organism does not decide to upregulate. The organism identifies an elevated chemical load and its metabolic systems respond the way any well-functioning biological system responds to sustained challenge by improving. This is, the research team notes, a general principle of human biology. Their systems improve under pressure. The senior medical officer was quiet. Then he asked whether the daily training routine Vasquez maintained throughout the transit might be understood as a related phenomenon, another system improving under pressure. I said I would ask the research team to address this in their supplemental report. He said please do. And then, after a pause, the organism improves under pressure. In all its systems, I said. That is the current assessment, yes. He did not ask another question. The third question came from the junior member of the board, a logistics officer, who had been quiet throughout the session. He asked whether there was any evidence that Vasquez was aware she was being recorded. The behavioral science team's assessment, probably yes, from approximately day 4. Quartures has a electromagnetic emission profile that a trained route and access surveyor would have the skills to detect. They assess that she knew she was being observed, that she knew approximately where the recording coverage extended, hence the northwest corner, blind spot, and that she conducted herself throughout the transit with awareness that her behavior might be reviewed. The logistics officer considered this. Then he said, so the 4-minute monologue on day 13, in the blind spot, where she made the decision not to act, she knew we might not hear it clearly. I said yes, he said, and she spoke it out loud anyway. I said yes. The behavioral science team's assessment is that verbalization is part of her professional process, not a communication to an observer. She was trained to voice her assessments. She did it regardless of audience, because she was talking to herself. The logistics officer nodded slowly. Then he said, she was doing her job. I said, that is as near as we can determine exactly what she was doing. For 14 days, under every tool we have, she was simply doing her job. The board chair closed the session. I will remain available for the supplemental session. Intend to provide the board with everything they need. I also intend to note, in my personal professional record, one observation that did not make it into the formal testimony, because it falls outside my pharmacological remit. On the day the archive review was completed, the day I sat alone in my office and listened to the full 14-day cell recording from beginning to in sequence. I came to the day 14 docking footage last. I watched the retrieval team open the cell. I watched Vasquez stand up. I watched her step into the corridor. She had never physically entered and navigated with the calm ease of someone who had walked it 100 times in her mind. And I watched her, as they passed the maintenance corridor junction, glance at it for 1 second, affirming it was where she expected it to be, and then look away and keep walking. I have been in containment pharmacology for 22 years. I have processed subjects from 41 different species. I have never once processed a subject who walked out of their containment cell already, knowing where everything was. The new classification category has 1 entry in the registry. I suspect that will not remain true for long.